Pride and envy are two human behaviors that, if left unchecked, can lead the way to a bitter end. Thomas Schumann found this out the hard way. Young, charismatic, and handsome, he was quickly making a name for himself in the sales world. This guy was so good, he could sell a ribeye steak to a vegan. And though each company that he worked for exalted him for his numbers, his success created jealousy amongst his peers. Thomas had heard of the gossip behind his back, but he didn't care. The others weren't even in his league, so why should he pay them any attention? One day he was approached by a couple of his team members, those he knew were part of the gossip, claiming there was one house he could never sell. There was a woman who lived in a quaint little cottage in the middle of the woods, and though many had tried to get her business, they had all failed. Thomas laughed and replied, "The only reason they couldn't sell her is they were not me. But I guarantee you, I will not fail." And with that, he headed for the door. But before he left the building, he was approached by a young office clerk. Despite his arrogance, she wished no ill will upon anyone. She warned him not to accept the challenge, saying that the others were just trying to mess with him, and they shouldn't give them the satisfaction. He blew her off, saying he would be the only one satisfied once he sold the woman in the woods. It was nearly dark when he arrived at the small cottage, as a twisted dirt path, far from any major routes, was the only way there. Walking up the front steps, he marveled at the home. The honey-colored exterior was constructed from some sort of material he had never seen before, and it had a certain sweet smell, like it was made of cookies instead of wood. With a single knock, the door opened, and a pretty young woman with brown hair stood just inside. Thomas flashed a smile and turned on the charm, and he barely started his pitch when she invited him inside. He agreed and felt a rush of excitement, as this seemed easier than he imagined. She led him to a round table and offered a few treats. He graciously accepted, as he had a strong sweet tooth and always thought it best to appease a host, as it made them more likely to buy. The woman brought him treat after treat as he moved into his sales pitch. She nodded along with every word he said, and seemed intent on accepting his offer. And it made perfect sense. Solar panels in a remote location like this would be perfect for her. When he had his fill of sweets, she led him to a back room, where she said her electrical system was located. He walked into a rustic room of iron and stone, and couldn't help but wonder how she had any electricity at all. He may not have been from the technical side, but he expected to see some sort of cables or fuse panel. With a shrug, he instead focused on his purpose, pointing to the walls and claiming how this would be the perfect spot for the installation. As he spoke, he heard a click and noticed the door behind him was closed. He figured it must have shut by accident, but when he tried to open it, he realized it was locked. Looking through the small window in the center of the door, he knocked and called out to the woman. She didn't pay any attention to him, and instead focused on stirring something in a strange pot. No, not a pot, a cauldron. Long lines, the length of the room, lit up on the walls and ceiling, first yellow, then orange, and then red. The room temperature began to increase, and Thomas realized the lines were coils, oven coils. Frantic, he pounded and pushed on the door, but it was solid steel and wouldn't budge. Sweat dribbled down his face. He then spotted the woman as she glanced over her shoulder. She was no longer young and beautiful, but twisted and hideous, and she cackled back at him. Thomas screamed and pounded on the walls and the door until they were all too hot to touch. Finally, his shouts stopped as his body was broiled. You see, not only had nobody ever been able to sell the woman anything, but anyone who went knocking on her door was never heard from again. Envy led Thomas to her doorstep, but his pride kept him from observing any warning signs, like her quick invitation, the endless supply of sweets, and the construction of her home. If he had, he would have realized that nobody should try and sell solar panels to a witch living in a house made of gingerbread.